I'm Dan Snow. Welcome to Voices of the First World War. In the years leading up to the centenary of the war, the last of those who actually experienced it have passed away. But the Imperial War Museums and the BBC had recorded interviews with many veterans to try to capture what it was like to actually be there. This series listens to those stories.
I don't remember any of the people who have described the Battle of Mons and the retreat ever mentioning what the weather was like. I can tell you it was damn hot every day of that retreat, boiling hot.
If we had an average sleep of 2 to 3 hours in a day, it's as much as we got. And that was only when we had a chance of getting to a cornfield, lying down, because we never knew when we moved on again. We might lay 5 minutes, move.
But you had to just, beat it off, because the Germans followed up very fast.
The hardships that followed the first clash on the Western Front, the Battle of Mons in late August 1914. The British had been driven back, the start of an infamous retreat. Their French allies had suffered unimaginable casualties. Germany thought victory was within its grasp. Some British reinforcements were told to turn around before they even reached the front line.
Well, after advancing several days into Belgium and passing these refugees, many of them with their little dog carts and piled with the pitiful possessions, prams, children, one thing and another, we found ourselves eventually going the same way as the refugees. So therefore we knew very well we were no longer advancing into Belgium.
In some parts it was almost chaos, and we had staff officers standing at crossroads, directing the traffic. What regiment are you? What regiment are you over there, that way?
And, of course, our road got more congested with refugees, and we got mixed up with the infantry, who, in turn, were getting more and more tired. They were carrying somewhere in the region of 100 pounds on the back, the infantry, which we did not have. And so, therefore, their feet got worse and worse.
With the Allies on the defensive, it seemed as though the Germans might seize Paris. By September the 7th, the British had retreated nearly 200 miles.
In this blazing hot sun, their feet had swollen inside their boots. They just couldn't bear to hobble along.
A lot of it was due to the fact that a number of them were reservists and had been called up just prior to the outbreak of war. And of course the first thing that happened to them, they were fitted out with kit, including boots, and they were very heavy. Well, before the war we were able to break them in, but they didn't get time. And if they got those boots off, they couldn't get them back on again.
What they did was they took their boots off, cut them off in places, tied the laces together, hung them round their necks, and then round their feet, the socks, they took off their puttees and wound their puttees round their feet and continued on the retreat that way. I think they were made of marvellous stuff to do that, because you imagine the hard roads, there were no soft roads in France, but they still kept their rifles and they kept their ammunition. So they were soldiers.
The German invasion plan relied on huge numbers of men marching on Paris as quickly as possible in a great arc through Belgium. The resulting campaign required an amazing feat of endurance from both sides.
They'd put stacks of bully beef and biscuits at the crossroads, so that the retreating troops could go and take what they wanted. They hadn't got to stand and wait for rations to come to them. The rations are there waiting for them.
From the time we engaged the enemy, the last meal we had was breakfast on the Sunday morning. But I never had a bite until we got into this village. Afterwards, we no field ovens then, or field kitchens, nothing supplied. And we weren't allowed to break into the emergency ration. That was a crime. That was one thing that stood out in my mind, how we carried on with very little sleep and very little food.
All the time we were retiring, the Germans were coming on and having all the food and that imaginable from the houses, and we were told then that we must live off the land. We must get everything we can from empty houses, otherwise the Germans would have it.
We had to find as much food as we could off the country, which amounted to fruit only. We got rather fed up with fruit. The houses that we entered and the villages were pretty well deserted then. There were no people about at all. That battle had pretty well scared them, and we met them later on in droves with the priest at their head. They were exhorting him not to let the Allemands get them. Of course, what could he do but just lead them?
Rations and so on for both men and horses were rather precarious. There were days that we went 2 and 3 days without any rations of any kind. And the water, the horses were starved more or less of water. When there was an opportunity for water, we went to these various streams with our buckets, and no sooner we got the water halfway back to them, we moved again. Away went the horse. And same with the corn and that sort of thing. They never had it. What was done voluntarily by men of our own feelings, the same as I had towards the animals. We went out in the fields and beat the corn and the oats out of the ears and brought them back. But that didn't save them. As the days went on, the horse's belly got up all in the middle of his back, and the cry was frequently down the line, "Saddler, plater and a punch," which meant that the saddler had to come along and punch some more holes in the horse's girth to keep the saddles on.
The German army was also suffering. Supplies were lagging behind the forward troops, as railways had been sabotaged in Belgium and France, and lorries had broken down. Men faltered in the heat as they tried to carry out the impossibly ambitious plans of their generals. Roads were strewn with dying animals. The heavy guns lagged behind. Both sides trudged grimly on. In places, the British and French allies encountered each other for the first time.
We were carrying on the retirement in the morning, and during that day we saw our first French troops, and I was surprised to see them. The cavalry were in action there with the cuirasses on, plumed helmets, the infantry with the red trousers, blue jacket.
You'd think we were back in the Napoleonic days, with the helmet and the horse's tail, breastplates, red uniforms and blue uniforms, like our hussars and things that we had. They went to battle in that.
No camouflage, no nothing. It absolutely showed up, you see, in the old way of square formation.
Of course, our clothes then were very funny. A blue jacket, a small cap, and our red trousers. It was really the best thing to be killed very promptly.
The British had recently fought in South Africa and learnt that bright colours in uniforms were an invitation to enemy snipers. The French had not made that transition. Their cavalry charged in polished metal cuirasses, breastplates. Bands marched ahead of attacks. It was suicidal. The British also encountered their German enemy.
Over the crest, about, 15,000 yards away, we saw something moving, and we put our barn stroud onto it. That's the rangefinder. And we saw that it was 3 enormous columns of Germans moving across this open country in mass formation.
All I do know is I had sore feet. We kept on moving 3 or 4 days. We marched from here to there. What the object of the exercise was, I can't tell you now.
We were told we were to make for Cateau, and that the 5th Division was holding an extended position, and we would get a night's rest. Which sounded very good, because we'd been very short of sleep really the last few nights. 10 o'clock at night, we got into the Cateau goods station, the whole battalion. A very lumpy cobbles on which we were required to lie down. One really couldn't sleep on them. They were too much. And people really walked about most of that night. You couldn't get much rest.
The British would occasionally stop and fight a fierce rearguard action along the retreat. The biggest was the full-scale battle at Le Cateau. Private Robert Money and Private Charles Ditcham were there.
At 1 a.m, my battalion went into a factory in the village of Le Cateau, and at 4 o'clock in the morning we moved out hurriedly because the German Uhlan was at the other end of the village. And we moved out, and then we took up a position to do a rearguard action for the expeditionary force.
Just before daylight, we got breakfast, and I remember I got a very good breakfast that morning. It was fried bacon with the bread fried in the bacon juice, and most welcome, and some very sweet tea. At 6, we were told to move back through Le Cateau and continue the withdrawal. And just then, we heard a lot of shooting in the town behind us. and the word went round that the Uhlans were in the town.
Well, we were just lined up in a cornfield with one company on the right, one company on the left. Middlesex and other people all mixed up in this, and this famous L battery behind us, the one that got blasted to pieces. And to me, I shall never see a picture like this in my life again. These Germans literally came in their hordes and were just shot down, but they still kept coming. There was sufficient of them to shove us out of the field eventually.
We were off our maps, we didn't know where we were. In the distance we could see people moving about. Whether they were German cavalry or our own cavalry, it was hard to say. The light was very bad by then.
Then the realization what war meant when you've seen my company sergeant major, for instance, a fellow called Sim, he was wounded in the mouth. He was going back dripping blood, and various people getting killed and wounded.
Intense rifle fire broke out from the Welsh Fusiliers who were on our right. And an officer near me, Captain Rose, was looking through his glasses and blew his whistle and said, "Stop, it's our own people." And the firing stopped like that.
From the air, the picture of what was happening was clearer.
We were easily able to see where the fighting was, because village after village began to burn. The desperate fighting was going on round the Cateau. There were no trenches. The infantry was constantly on the move, digging themselves in where they could. Dispatch riders were galloping about. We could see guns being limbered up and drawn back, others in front firing at point-blank range, and little islands of troops surrounded by the enemy still fighting on.
What I shall never understand is what I was supposed to do with a bugle in the front line, except to blow if my platoon officer told me to blow. What would be asked to blow, I wouldn't honestly know now. I couldn't blow ceasefire because it didn't mean a thing.
Down the roads leading south was a continuous stream of transport. Refugees, guns, infantry and cavalry all mixed up together.
The British fought tenaciously, but the Germans outflanked them and drove them back. The retreat recommenced, although the British resistance had bought the BEF a small breathing space.
One night I stayed awake all night. The sound, the noises. You could hear the noises of battle, you see, in the distance. But I felt very tired the next day. It was a very wearing experience, you know.
We finally got to St Quentin. There we had a halt in the main square, and everybody was dead beat. They were just falling down and absolutely tired out.
Oh, whack to the world. Whack to the world. We laid down, I slept for about 18 hours, I think, must have done.
The British and French armies had been battered, but not broken. Outside Paris, they were joined by reinforcements, which allowed them to launch a desperate counterattack. The exhausted Germans panicked. The strains of their advance had opened up gaps between the different parts of their forces. It turned into the Battle of the Marne, a victory for the Allies, which would force the German Imperial Army to abandon its push on Paris and retreat to the northwest. But to the troops, it was all just another set of orders.
Well, as long as you were going forward and pushing the German, you could go forever. To go the other way, you were depressed forever. I mean, that was my feeling. Your whole morale was down in your boots. But directly you went forward and were going forward, you talk about something lifting you up to the heavens. That was the difference between advance and retreat.